All right, folks, good evening.
Sorry.
I'm Martha Remington, co-chairman of the Bolton Historical Commission, and I would like to introduce to you some folks from Mass Historical and our preservation consultant. We have Betsy Friedberg, who's the National Register Director, and we have Ben Haley, who is her assistant. And in the center is Ann Forbes, our preservation consultant. And I would like to also introduce the members of the Bolton Historical Commission who are attending this evening. We have Alice Coggeshall, we have Stacy Iponic, we have Jean Marie Padovano, Bill Nichols, and Bob Bush. And we do have Tim Feeler here from the Bolton Historical Society. So without further ado, we will begin the program. What is this, further ado? Without further delay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Martha. So we're talking tonight about the PAN, National Register District, which is going to be considered by our State Review Board at their meeting next week. And as you may know, it was originally intended to be considered in March, but because there was not a quorum at that meeting, the Commission was unable to consider it. So at the meeting next week, we'll do a very brief presentation of the nomination, but the Commissioners already have copies of the nomination. So what we'd like to do this evening is to talk a little bit about the National Register program and what it means to be listed in the National Register and what it doesn't mean. And some of this may be quite familiar to you because we've done this before in Bolton. The Bolton Center National Register District happened about 20 years ago. And I know I was here for that meeting as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the National Register program. It was established more than 50 years ago in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. In part, it was established in response to urban renewal and destruction of some parts of our community's historic character and in an effort to find a way to recognize that our communities have very important historic roots. This program was established. In Massachusetts, there are more than 75,000 properties in the National Register. We're one of the leaders in terms of the number of listings, and including more than 1,700 National Register districts that range in size from 3 properties to about 2,000 properties. And all the illustrations are kind of hard to see, but all the photos I'm going to show are of properties that are listed in the National Register. So in each state, the State Historic Preservation Office administers the National Register program and is an intermediary between the community and the National Register program, which is in Washington and is part of the National Park Service. So that's our office. Ben and I are on the staff of the Massachusetts Historical Commission. We were established in 1963 to identify, evaluate, and protect the significant historic and archaeological resources of the Commonwealth, and our chairman is Secretary of State William Galvin. Our office is also the office of the State Historic Preservation Officer, who is our executive director, Brana Simon, and the state archaeologist, also Brana Simon. So Bolton, as I said, has had some National Register properties listed, and the Whitman Inn and Farm was listed in 2002, the Pan Burying Ground in 2007. Anne is quite familiar with both of those. And then the Bolton Center National Register District was listed in 1997, and that's just the cover of the form itself.
Excuse me, that's Whitcomb.
Whitcomb. Whitcomb. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay.
Yeah. So you've had experience with the National Register program, but it has been a while since you did a National Register District. So let me show you some other kinds of resources all throughout the state that are listed in the National Register. Downtowns, like the Washington Street Shoe District in Lawrence, is a National Register district. Rural areas, and the Elm Hill Farm in Brookfield is both these pastures and fields, and then a fairly extensive farm complex. It's now partly an Audubon sanctuary. And apparently it's where Elsie the cow came from before she went to the World's Fair in 1930, whatever. So, residential neighborhoods like this one in West Brookfield, industrial areas such as the Boot Mill in Lowell, which is part of the National Register, Locks and Canals National Register District, are also listed in the National Register. Some of the properties that are listed in the register are very, very old, and we do have the largest collection of pre-1700 houses in the nation, and a number of them were listed in the National Register as thematic listing a number of years ago. And the Payne Dodge House is one built in 1695. And then some that are relatively recent. The Haggerty House in Cohasset was built in 1938. It was the second house that Walter Gropius designed after he came to this country from Germany. The first was his own house in Lincoln that's now a house museum that belongs to Historic New England. And Haggerty House in Cohasset is a private property. Two interesting things. One about the Payne Dodge House. When we were doing the nomination, it did say 1695 on the chimney rest, but all the documentation that we had suggested it was slightly younger. So we listed it with about a 1710 date, although the owner insisted that she knew it was 1695. At the time that it was listed, the science of dendrochronology was just coming into being, and that's when little fragments of timbers are extracted and then inspected under a microscope, and you can tell from the rings, not just the year that the timber was felled, but the season. And so that happened with the Payne Dodge House after it was listed, and lo and behold, she was right, 1695. So we corrected the nomination. The Haggerty House was built using modern materials, and it's right in the ocean. On the ocean, you can see just a sliver of it on the right. And those materials haven't really held up well to the wind and the salt water and the air. So there have been replacements of materials over time with that particular house. Some of the properties listed in the register are public, like the Center School in Shirley. Others are private. The Sergeant Robinson House in Gloucester is one such private property that was listed in the National Register not that long ago. Another familiar one for Anne. So those are all buildings, but in addition to buildings, the National Register also includes sites. Here is a cemetery in North Hadley that's listed in the National Register on its own and is a significant historic site. Structures in Holly, the charcoal kiln, which is in the Holly State Forest, and the carousel in Holyoke, which is one of several historic carousels in Massachusetts and that are all listed in the National Register. Objects such as the street clock in Boston, one of the milestones, there's a number of milestones were listed as thematically all at once a number of years ago, and that's the one from that marks the distance from Arlington to Boston. And then this statue by the sculptor Catherine Lane Weems, also listed in the National Register. So it's not just buildings that are listed. Landscapes are also listed, and National Register districts that include a number of different features are listed in the register. So in Wendell, you have a mix of public and private buildings arranged around the town common, the church and the firehouse, the town hall, the library, and a number of other buildings are all part of a National Register district. And then in Marblehead, this is a very dense district in Old Town Marblehead. It's one of the largest ones that we have, although in terms of acreage, it's not that large, but it's very, very dense. This district associated with the maritime history of Marblehead is a National Register district, with buildings dating from the early 18th century to the 20th century. So National Register districts are ensembles. They're a mix of buildings and structures and sites and objects and landscapes that together tell a story about a particular aspect of a community. And I noticed as I drove in that you have a nice sign for Bolton Center Historic District, and many towns choose to have signs that mark their National Register districts, but it's not imperative that a sign be placed. Some properties are eligible for listing only in a district because they're part of this ensemble. On Columbia Road in Boston, which is very near to our office, this group of apartment buildings is listed as a National Register district. Each building in itself is not particularly exceptional, but as a group they tell a story about urban development in this part of Boston in the early 20th century. Some properties are of outstanding merit on their own, and this is one such building, the Reeves Tavern in Wayland, which is an early 18th century tavern. John Adams stayed here on the old Connecticut path, and it's listed on its own. Some properties are eligible both on their own and as part of a district. So the Catherine Lee Bates House in Falmouth, where it was the home of the woman who wrote America the Beautiful, is also part of a Falmouth Village Green Historic District, National Register Historic District. So in order to be eligible for listing in the National Register, properties have to meet at least one of 4 criteria, and they also need to retain enough of their historic character or integrity to be able to convey their significance. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that we brought handouts about all of this if you want to pick something up afterwards. One of them explains the criteria in greater detail. But there are 4. And the first one is criterion A, which is association with events and patterns of development. So the Old Brick School in Oakham was listed in part because of its the story that it would tell about the community's commitment to educating their young children in the mid-19th century. The three-deckers in Worcester, we did a large number of three-deckers collectively, and this was a particularly fine grouping of three-deckers that are significant architecturally, but also because of what they tell about social history, immigrant history, economic development, and ethnic history. So they're very important in that respect. Properties can be listed on because of their associations with significant people. So the Fitzhenry, or formerly Fitzhugh Lane House in Gloucester, is associated with the painter of maritime landscapes. It's nationally significant. Fitzhenry Lane is well known nationally. In Foxborough, this little house of Ezra Carpenter is significant locally because Ezra Carpenter was well known in the town of Foxborough as the maker of straw hats, and that was apparently done at one wing of his house. It also should have Mrs. Carpenter's name in there because you can be sure that she was making straw hats as well. Properties can be eligible for their design and construction. So in Amherst, the Baird House is the only house in our state that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was built in 1958. If you've ever been to the Zimmerman House in New Hampshire, which is a museum house, that's another Frank Lloyd Wright house, this one is very similar. The Golden Hill Bridge in Lee was a lenticular truss bridge designed resembling a lens, hence its name, built in 1885. And I should mention that it was listed in the National Register about 30 years ago. It was then replaced, and so there's a modern bridge in its place. It was actually taken apart, and I think it's been stored at UMass Amherst for study, but it's no longer in its place, but it was listed in the National Register. And then in Harwich, this little Greek Revival house was the home of Captain Barry, who was a maritime captain, and it's a well-preserved example of the Greek Revival style with the gable facing front. Properties can also be significant for their potential to tell stories in the future. That's criterion D, which most often applies to properties that are of archaeological significance, which is not to say that one would go out and dig any of these. On the contrary, it's just that we know enough about these particular places to know that there are likely resources that are not visible to the naked eye that, should they come to light, would be of importance. The Richmond Furnace was a massive iron-making industrial enterprise that's now completely in the midst of a forest, and it's a National Register district. Town Brook in Plymouth is located close to Plymouth Rock. It's the brook that was the earliest location of settlement. There was a lot of industrial development along here from the 17th century into the late 19th century, and then became, as Plymouth became a place that people were coming to visit, the town decided that they wanted it to be a little more bucolic looking, so they embarked on a project working with the Olmsted firm to make it into a park. So the industrial buildings were removed, but you can just make out here these little indentations are the remains of some wharf areas that were associated with industry. And most, as we say here, many properties, but most properties that are listed in the register meet more than one criterion. And this one in particular, the home of Tom Thumb and his wife Lavinia Bump in Middleborough, met criteria A, B, and C. So it was A for its associations with the development of the town of Middleborough, B for its associations with Tom Thumb, who was with the Ringling Brothers Circus, and his wife, who was also in the circus, and C as a well-preserved Second Empire-style house that actually in its interior had features that were particularly tailored to be used by Tom Thumb and his wife. His other name escapes me at the moment. But stairs that were half height, very low. It still had a very low dry sink, and some other features of that nature. In order to nominate a property, there's a National Register nomination prepared, such as Anne has prepared, and we brought some copies of the nomination that were sent to our review board. There's also a copy at the library if people want to review it. But they're the documents that tell the story, that support the eligibility of historic resources for listing. So they explain what's included in the nomination, and they show why they demonstrate retains sufficient historic integrity to be able to support their eligibility, and they tell particular stories, and all of that is spelled out in the nomination. The nomination in Newburyport in the upper right tells another of those maritime stories, because Newburyport was another important center for maritime activity from the 18th into the 20th century. Colonel Ashley House is a well-preserved 18th century house. It also was the home of a woman whose name was Elizabeth Freeman, otherwise known as Mum Bet, who was the first slave to successfully petition for her freedom. So nominations, particularly for districts, can include a wide range of properties, and every nominated district has a period of significance that usually begins with the date of the first extant structure, or the approximate date, and usually ends 50 years prior to today. The rationale being that we need the distance of 50 years in order to fully appreciate significance of an historic property. So here's a district in Dalton, the Cranesville National Register District, which had important associations with paper making, among other activities. So this wonderful mill is one of the buildings that's in the district. But then so are those little capes. It's just a little enclave that's within the district called Veterans Village. It was built in the early 1950s using federal funds to house returning veterans and their families. And so you've got a 100-year span of resources that are both equally important in telling the story about the development of the town of Dalton. National Register districts also can include properties that are considered non-contributing, and usually that's because they're relatively recent in construction or because they've been vastly altered and no longer retain their historic character. So in Sheffield, another Western Mass district, the Sheffield Plain National Register District, the building on the right with the gable front is a mid-19th century business block. The building on the left is a 1970s bank building. So the bank building is physically within the boundary of the district, but it's considered non-contributing. Now actually we're getting close to the point at which that bank building would be 50 years old. So if asked, we might go back and revisit that nomination, as we have been doing occasionally with other nominations, and that building might become contributing. So here's just some pieces of the documentation, which you'll also see if you pick up the nomination. It includes a number of maps, parcel maps, a U.S. Geological Survey map, many photographs, and then something called the district data sheet, which is basically an index of every single building, structure, site, and object within the boundaries. And so Anne had to spend a considerable amount of time working on that. It's all matched up to parcel numbers and to numbers from our database, inventory form numbers. It says what the style of the building is, what its historic name is, and whether it contributes or is not contributing. And that's an invaluable index for the future. So properties need to be significant, as I said, and they need to maintain their integrity or historic character. They don't need to be in pristine, immaculate condition. So here's a National Register district in New Bedford, the Acushnet Heights National Register District, which is largely houses built for workers in the cotton mills that were along the river at the foot of a hill. Acushnet Heights was the hills above the cotton mills. These buildings, some of them have asphalt siding, some have asbestos siding, some have vinyl siding, some have window changes, some have lost their porches. There are all sorts of changes, small changes that have happened to these buildings, but together they still read as historic buildings. They still are able to tell us a very important story about the development of New Bedford. So there are none of these that would be considered non-contributing, even though they have some alterations. Buildings in the register don't have to serve their original purpose. So the Beacon gas station is one of a number of gas stations that were built in the 1920s around Greater Boston to mimic the State House Dome. And there are, I think, 5 that survive. And this one is near me in the town of Stoneham. Actually, it's for sale now. So I'm a little anxious about what's going to happen to it. It used to be an ice cream parlor.
It looks like an ice cream.
Yeah, and then Christmas
Dairy
trees.
Queen or something.
Yeah.
I used to live in Reading, I know that.
You know that building, and you know it's for sale. It's I'm nervous about it. And then in Weston, the Kendall Green Station is right on the railroad tracks, but it's no longer a station. It's a private home, and I was told that at one time, at least, the woman who lived there sold coffee out her kitchen window. So it's not a station. Nobody can come inside, but it's still retains its relationship to the railroad tracks. Properties in the register don't need to be open to the public, not even a single day. No one's going to be looking over your shoulder and trying to see what you're doing with your own property and visiting it. A National Register listed building doesn't have to be painted in particular colors. And here's one example. In the Old Village Historic District and National Register District in Chatham, the Hallett store, which is really quite wild. Glow in the dark colors. In a sea of white, it's really stands out. So, it's important to remember that a National Register District is not the same as a local historic district. They're 2 very different designations, and one does not lead to another, and that's something we really want to stress here. And if you could hold up the flyer we have, there's a difference which was sent to all property owners, but it's really very important if people have questions to take a look at that. And here's basically what that says. So there's a big difference between a local historic district and a National Register District. A National Register District is through the National Park Service. It's a formal recognition that a group of properties is significant. In a way, it's giving it sort of an elevated status to say this is an important area or important property, and think about how important it is looking ahead into the future. But it doesn't bring with it any oversight over what changes that are being made to it using private fund, unless only if there is state or federal involvement, and by involvement we mean federal or state funding, permitting, or licensing. Then there's the opportunity to review the project and see what its impact would be. So that review would be administered through our office, and one of the most common reviews we do is for state highway projects. Road widenings, road changes that might have an impact on historic resources would be reviewed in our office. And I have some other examples I'll show in a moment. Local Historic District is a stronger preservation tool, actually. It's established by 2/3 majority of a town meeting or by vote of city council. It's a local decision, and that's the one that brings with it establishment of a design review board where property owners have to come before that board to get an approval, a certificate of appropriateness, before they make changes that would be visible from a public way. And many communities do have local historic districts, but this National Register effort does not lead to a local historic district. If your community is interested, then you can certainly consider it. So what are the benefits of listing on the National Register? Some of the local benefits are community pride, posting of signs that lets people know that they're entering an historic area, public education, heritage tourism. There are limited opportunities for funding, particularly through the Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund, which is a matching grants program administered through our office. And I know that the Bolton Town Hall is one such recipient of grant through that, we call it MPPF program. In communities with CPA, there's opportunities that can come with National Register listing, and it's a planning tool. So here are two examples. The sign on the left is for a MPPF project. We also do a publication on historic places for historic parties that lists National Register properties that can be rented or used for events such as weddings. It's supposed to be the #2 bestseller at the State House bookstore. And we've just done a new edition of it. So here's that National Register certificate, Martha, that we were talking about. So we send out a certificate signed by Secretary Galvin and by Bronna Simon after the listing has occurred. And it's a paper certificate about 8.5 by 11.
Yeah.
Suitable for framing, but it's not a bronze plaque. The bronze plaques are ones that one could purchase if you're interested. We don't provide them. And there are a number of manufacturers around. We don't recommend one over another, but we do get brochures from a number of places, so we'd be happy to share information about that. And then here's another one of those National Register district signs that the community has put up. That one's in Sheffield. Teaching tools. In some communities, because local history is a topic that I think is, or used to be, required in 4th grade curriculum, some communities have used National Register nominations as a basis for lesson plans. There's a formal program through the National Register and the National Trust called Teaching with Historic Places that designs lesson plans based around particular places based on National Register nominations. For instance, the boot mill that I showed earlier in Lowell, to teach about a particular theme. So that one is teaching about industrialization. And that they are intended that students can learn without actually visiting the site. There's one about the Kennedy birthplace, and there are dozens of them. In Lowell, they've taken their National Register districts and made them into walking tours. So they have little brochures that are distributed throughout the city. So that's another way that a National Register nomination can be the basis for education and information. Here are more, is another one of those MPPF signs and a few other projects that benefit from the Preservation Projects Fund, which is for properties that belong to municipalities and private nonprofit organizations. For private homeowners, unfortunately, there's no such incentive program. So it's really for private homeowners largely a recognition that your particular neighborhood or your particular property is special and unique, and what makes Bolton Center different from the Pan District, different from Acton Center, different from any other community is identified through that National Register district. There are state and federal rehabilitation tax credits for properties that are income producing, and that's for substantial and major rehabilitation of those properties, and are designed so that even if the use changes, the historic features of a property remain. So the Chelsea Post Office is one example, no longer used as a post office and in very deteriorated form. It was rehabilitated as a community college, but maintaining that wonderful lobby and other historic features in the process, and the owners received a tax credit for that. National Register nominations are planning tools. As I said, it's a way of identifying that an area is significant, and it doesn't guarantee it's going to be preserved under a bell jar forever, but it's a way of ensuring that it gets a voice. It raises its profile. So here are a couple different examples. The Falmouth Village Green was another one of these areas where there was going to be a road widening project that would have had a significant impact on the Village Green in Falmouth, and it was a National Register district. And so the project was reviewed. There were opportunities to see if there was a way to minimize or mitigate the impact of the project, and in the end the project was slightly changed so that it had less of a severe impact upon the Village Green. Rockland Public Library, like many libraries, didn't meet the needs of the modern world and needed an addition, and received some state funds to do that. And the project was reviewed, and there were chances to comment on the nature of the addition, so that the addition in the end did not have a major impact upon the historic character of the historic part of the library. And Northampton State Hospital was one of many state hospitals that, as you probably know, were closed in the 1980s or otherwise disbanded. And these are huge state-owned properties that suddenly came into the opportunity for other uses. We did a thematic National Register nomination at the time for about 20 of these campuses that were highly significant and identified some of the important features of the campuses. One of them was Northampton State Hospital, and it's an extraordinary collection of buildings and a very important story about care for those with disabilities and mental illness. In the end, almost all of the buildings were demolished, but there was a consideration of what was happening before it actually was done, and they were documented through the National Register process. So, National Register designation is an effort that takes a while, and it's done cooperatively in the community, and property owners and the preservation consultant, there's a familiar face there, work together to achieve the National Register designation. And that is this little quick tour through the National Register program. I'd be happy to answer questions, but Anne is also going to talk about what she's learned about the pan. So,
Will there be further pictures, or should I?
she has pictures, yes.
I have some, but
Yeah.
you might want to fire a few questions.
Do you have-
That's the intent at this point.
We're happy to answer questions.
Anything you've just heard.
While I switch to this.
Something just occurred to me that
All right.
flew out of my mind.
Yeah, try that.
Oh, I know. When you were talking about certain amount of adaptation, like in that last library project, what about the interface with the building code? Because the National Register can be of help in certain cases with some National Register
Right.
listed buildings.
Well, certainly for museum buildings that are considered totally preserved buildings, that offers the opportunity for exemption from certain aspects of the building code.
I'm pointing at Tim here.
Oh, what?
Museum buildings, there's one.
But partially preserved or properties that are eligible or listed in the National Register also can be eligible for some sorts of variances from some of the stringencies of the building code.
Does the same apply to ADA? Because I talk to people who have buildings, historic buildings, who are often frankly put off from doing things to them because the ADA compliance costs are so high.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I was thinking.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. And we have a staff architect, Paul Holtz, who does quite a bit of advising with owners for ADA compliance.
Are there exceptions for historic buildings?
Well, there are other ways. Well, there are other ways that accessibility can be achieved that don't have as intense an impact as, for instance, a large zigzag ramp across the front of a building. So that's one of the things we would be looking for, or elevators inserted into the back in a discrete manner, or in the case of, for instance, of a museum building where it's impossible to get accessibility to the second floor without major changes to the little charming little staircase. There are other ways to provide information about the property without actually physically going there.
Ms. Friedberg, we must have gone through that process when we added onto our 1903 public library, which at
Yes.
the time
Yeah.
was in the center, Bolton Center Historic
Right.
District.
And probably use state funds to do that. So I'm sure it was a project that our office reviewed. And we review thousands and thousands of projects every year. It's just part of the natural permitting process. It doesn't slow down the project. It's just part of what our office does.
I know of several incidences where it was a great benefit in that huge era of funding for public libraries, which seemed to take place over 20 years, a while ago. Many of them benefited in the design that they ended up with by being on the National Register. because there was a certain amount of leeway that could be exercised.
And change, skip ahead? Or do you want to
Yeah.
change seats?
Let's change seats, and there are a couple of blanks here. So fire questions about your own proposed district as I go along. I just wanted to show you a few highlights and to give you a flavor of what the State Review Board at the Mass Historical Commission will be seeing when they take their vote. So for the slide presentations to the State Review Board, we give kind of the highlights of a proposed district like this. And for the Pan district, which you knew the number better than I did, which has, what, 100 plus historic resources in it, we give the highlights of the various periods throughout its development and emphasize the way that the area did develop. There are 300 acres there in what we're proposing for the Pan district, and as you know, the name came partly from the geology there, that it's this wide, flat bottom basin. That was good for agriculture of various sorts, and the district also includes the west slope of Long Hill, which was associated with the development around the Pan. The first slide notes the fact that there was very early a very important intersection here. The main road that went east-west from Lancaster through Concord and on to Boston was intersected by the main road that went south, which today is right opposite the buildings in this slide. And the building on the left there is one of the earlier ones, 1780s, replaced a former building. This is the Thomas Osborne Tavern, and it's oriented to face right down that road leading south. Today's Hudson Road, and that's a very common situation to see in some early districts, that they will cluster around an important intersection like that. Bolton amazes me, and you should be aware of this too, for its number of surviving early industrial sites. Archaeological sites, yes, but so much of what you've got here from those early industrial sites are visible and visitable above ground. These are not buried sites. This, for instance, although it's on private property, this was the sawmill, the foundation of the Baker Sawyer sawmill, which began late 18th century. It was taken over by different owners, hence the transition from the name Baker to Sawyer. And there are extensive survivals of structures on several properties, some of them town-owned, some of them privately owned. And Martha, you and I did quite a long walk several years ago through the private property that was formerly the Skinner property, as you know, which had not only the site of the Baker Sawyer sawmill, but the dams, the remnants of the mill pond, as the Great Brook winds down there through that part of the district that is just north of Route 117.
And the grist mill, too.
Well, that is our next slide. Whoops, it isn't quite our next slide. This was the house of the earlier owner, Samuel Baker, and later became owned by the Sawyer family. Again, the main thing I want to point out here is with our earliest houses here in this district. It's another house which faces south because that was the best orientation for these colonial houses. And I think we already commented on the fact that it's actually got its back to Route 117 because it was facing south. And you see right there the solar panels that were put on that side because it is the south side. And this, just on the other side of 117 from 392 Main Street, which was the Baker Sawyer house, is the slightly later grist mill. That was added to the mill complexes and took advantage of power just a little further down the Great Brook, had its own dam, and this is now owned by the town. So you really have a sacred responsibility as a town, and I hope your town government and your town's people know this. We also recently documented the Corn Road Dam, which is that's part of a conservation area, and you know about your stone structures across the road here with the other mill pond that is actually within the Bolton Center National Register District.
Technically, excuse me, the Bolton Conservation Trust is a private entity, but,
Okay, that, you mean
it's not
Corn
the
Road?
town proper, but it is protected by the fact that the grist mill is.
Oh, you're talking about the grist mill?
Yes,
Yeah.
in this
Yes,
shot here.
you're right. But it is, it's accessible to the public.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was a gift to the Conservation Trust.
thank you. So this is an extraordinary structure in many ways, as are the other pieces on the grist mill site. As time moved along, especially with that intersection and with those developing local and regional industries, one of the main periods of architectural development on the Pan was the federal period, just right after the Revolutionary War and through the first couple decades of the 19th century. So you have some wonderful houses that are remaining from that period. This one you're all familiar with. This is 401 Main Street, and it is the John Sawyer house, and it fronts on the large property that includes the sawmill remnants behind it. It later became an important farm under John Francis Sawyer, and he was the one who built the beautiful barn in 1874, a whole 2 generations after after his father's house was built in 1827. You have several of these federal period houses with hipped roofs, some with end chimneys, interior side chimneys, and this one has a pair of rear chimneys. So you have slight variation among your hip roof federal houses in that district. The later barn, which is one of the kind that has a drive-through aisle right down the center, was listed in the assessor's valuations as at one point as the highest valued outbuilding in town. Very important barn. Here's another of the hip-roofed houses, 421 Main Street. Miles and Whitcomb House. Again, this is one that grew, but the important additions also helped to make it eligible for the National Register. And you can see again the incorporation of solar panels within these districts. And probably The one that's best known from that federal period is the Ephraim Osborne House up on the hill at 96 Long Hill Road. This is your big brick one. It had 2 facades. It was built about 1815. Actually, it has 3 facades and many fireplaces, and very well preserved. If you look at what's going on across the front of this house, look carefully at the arrangement of the windows as well. Bolton is very fortunate to have some examples of a type of house plan that's really only been understood over the last 25 years or so by some of the scholars in the area. There are a lot of these in Rhode Island as well. It's a plan called the Square Plan House. It began, a lot of them are 1-story houses, and they were mistaken for Cape Cod houses until you went inside them, and it's clear that the floor plan is different from a Cape Cod house. And one of the characteristics is that the facade is often non-symmetrical. The arrangement inside is often non-symmetrical. So this is a Burnham Road, 121 Burnham Road, the William Coolidge house. And this also was early 19th century. Back to some outbuildings. These are the barns that go along with the Ephraim Osborne house at 96 Long Hill Road, and they're from 2 different periods. And one was a horse barn, one was a big cow barn. Horse barn on the left, the cow barn on the right. And related to all of this, of course, is still surviving important landscape, which you have quite a bit of in the Pan District. And as Betsy said, historic landscapes also are eligible for the National Register. This is on the other side of Long Hill Road, and there's a well-defined cart path here that leads down toward West Pond. And it's lined, you can see a bit of the stone wall that lines the cart path on the left. And then you have some wonderful later resources. Speaking of the pond, those 2 ponds, West Pond and Little Pond, on either side of Hudson Road, became important through the 19th century, both for the ice business and eventually for recreation. And clustered around them were some late 19th century and early 20th century cottages, cabins, and what we call in Massachusetts camps, of course. And this is the Little Person's Camp, which we discovered in the process of this actually was built a little earlier probably than we thought it was. We thought it was 1920 because the person's family bought it in the 1920s, but it probably was owned by the Sargent, put up by the Sargent family and rented out a little earlier than that. We see it on the assessor's reports in the late teens. As you know, this is owned by the town. Well loved, hopefully, but will take a lot of care, and the National Register will be beneficial to this building, to what can happen to it. It'll make it more eligible for public funding, which we hope will be of benefit to its preservation. And also some very, very unique other later resources, some of them existing on the Boy Scout camp. This is part of the Cub Scout camp at
129.
129, thank you. I thought I had the address in my head, but I don't. 121. You sure this is 129? Anyway, you can see it from the road, going down Hudson Road, and you see a little pond behind it. Again, stone chimney, that first half of the 20th century, a feature of a lot of these recreational buildings. Betsy mentioned that we're now including within that pre-50-year cutoff time, houses that really were not in the public consciousness a while ago as being eligible for the National Register or contributing to our community's character. And in the case of Bolton, what we've got here in the pan is now some mostly small houses that are actually post-date Route 495. And that's something it's kind of hard to get our heads around, but it's a type of development, one type of development that was brought by the major highways in the second half of the 20th century. And here in the pan, it was relatively small, relatively minor. Here, Route 495 did not bring a sudden development of closely packed subdivisions, for instance. And some of them are really beautiful. This is, I believe, 81 Burnham Road. This may be my last slide. But there are several there on Burnham Road. And we even included things like the gas station on 117 and the ranch house beside it, because they were good examples of that latter part of the period of significance that is now fading beyond 50 years ago. So those are just a few highlights, and thank you all for your own knowledge that you contributed to understanding this very unique district.
Thank you so much, Ann. I think one of the best benefits about the proposed Pan Historic District is it will dispel those rumors about how the pan got its name from a frying pan that was passed around to the different houses, or a warming pan on extra cold evenings.
Well, that kind of overlaps though, because there were early references to the fact that it kind of was shaped like a frying pan.
Well, I mean,
flat bottom.
It was our preservation plan that was pointed out. Mulholland, what was his name? The gentleman who wrote the preservation plan that mentioned that it was a geological term.
Oh, that's
a
the
flat,
Al
often
Lima.
wet
Al
area.
Lima,
Yes,
he was
Al Lima.
he was very into the genealogical background. Yeah.
But there were a lot of rumors about other
Yeah.
pans.
Yeah. You still think of it that way. Flat bottom.
Well, thank you so very much for this snow-delayed presentation of the Pan Historic District. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that we'll next week get this passed through. We certainly didn't have good luck with snow and storms this particular year. And so thank you for this. We will take some of
Yes,
these
please
to
do.
have for questions and things.
So one thing I was talking about, I think before we began, was that next week, our review board is going to be considering this nomination along with 4 others that were postponed from the snowy days of March. We're not going to do a full presentation. I'm just going to do a 30-second summary of each one, because they all already received the nominations, and we were able, even though we didn't have a quorum, to do the presentations in March for informational purposes. So presuming that they vote favorably, which I have no reason to think they won't, then we'll, Ben and I, go over one more time and make sure all the i's are dotted and t's are crossed, and then we'll get ready to send it to the National Park Service in Washington. And when we do that, the transmittal package will also be sent to your commission, and Ann will get a copy, and a few others will also get copies, so that you know that it's in progress. Once it's listed, it's posted in a report that we get, and then we'll prepare the certificate, and it will be signed by the secretary and by Ronna Simon, and then it will be sent to you. Postcards will then go to all the property owners, and then you can decide if you want to have a party and have those small certificates as well.
And of course, eventually, these will all be on your Macris listing,
Right.
available
Exactly,
online,
exactly. So yes, we scan everything and then they'll be available.
and get that nice annual update that shows how towns are progressing
Right.
to save their historic resources. Thank you so very much.
Oh, thank you
Thank
for
you.
all your work.
Party at your house, Martha?
Pardon me?
Party at your house, I
Party? Why not?
It's a great opportunity to
The jewel of the pan.
showcase your commission too, and the work that you do, you know. I hope you really take advantage of the publicity that is, you know, a natural follow-up to this once it does get listed.
Oh, and we'll do a press release. I forgot to mention that.
Assume you have it laid out, but how far, you've got persons, how far beyond south does the district go?
It ends with Persons Park, that's the southernmost.
There's a map here and
Okay.
a copy of the nomination too.
That was just a registration form.
Yeah, look at the map, Tim, because it does sort of skirt certain things, like there are difficulties kind of figuring out the best boundaries on the east side of Hudson Road, for instance, where there are a lot of later buildings, there's the whole Girl Scout camp, and we were able to find a natural boundary there that came along that pipe, you know, there's a pipeline that comes diagonally down through the Girl Scout land.
So in both of those cases, the Girl Scout and the Boy Scout camps only portion of the
Right,
land is
there
included.
seemed no point in trying to include those large camps. And they probably wouldn't have been too happy with our doing that. So there were natural ways to include a
I'm
portion.
collecting
For his side?
each of these for
Okay.
for us.
Alice is a double agent.
You can also leave nice sample.
I have a double mole.
A double mold.
The society's mole on the committee.
She's a mole.
She's a mole on the society.
She's embedded, she's a deep state.
Embedded, yeah. Funny. Oh, the switch page, this is nothing, detach your.
Oh, right.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
Alice, do you want to go in on Wednesday to the meeting?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you want to go in with me to the meeting on
You're going to
Wednesday?
give a
Next
brief
Wednesday?
presentation,
You don't need
so you
to.
don't need me.
No.
Okay,
It's 1
good,
o'clock,
that's good to know.